An elf wakes up one day to suddenly realize that their human spouse hasn't aged a single day since they met 50 years ago. As Leandra studied the grove, she carefully pruned a branch here, a branch there. Each of these trees would someday make a fine bow, but the shaping was a long, slow, steady process. She'd first planted these, why? 60 years ago. Before she went adventuring, in fact. She smiled. Some of them were even ready to harvest soon. The enchantments in the wood laid on and augmented so many times taking hold, her husband might actually get to use one while he still had the strength in those great arms of his. She glanced at the sun for a moment as she walked inside. Her husband would still be at the barracks, training the children in how to properly wield a sword, the nice, quiet, relaxing life they had between adventures. She had a few hours. She could lay back and relax for a few, meditate on her spells before conjuring up some dinner. As she settled in, crossing her legs and focusing on nothing, mind drifting away, she suddenly stopped. How long before she went adventuring had she planted these trees? Perhaps a decade. She'd met her husband, who she thought was in his 20s, perhaps 30s, the barest hints of gray in his beard, shortly after. That was 50 years ago. She knew he was a ranger, or other spell sword of some description, but had never even thought of giving him one of these bows until today. Because she'd assumed, when they married, he'd be too old to wield one when they reached the right age. She thought of how her husband had looked that morning, as he headed off to the training fields. Was there any more gray in his beard than the day they met? She didn't think so. Leandra rose to her feet, and muttered a few words as she stepped out the door, the wood slowly sliding shut behind her with a wave farewell, as she stalked towards the barracks, the soil seeming to carry her along, each step taking her 100 yards, as the homes blurred by. And she arrived. To see her husband, Maxim, standing tall, ahead over any of his students, casually holding one over his head with one arm as he demonstrated how to fight with an injured limb. Standing much taller than herself for that matter. Fairly fit, but not perfect. And when she focused, she could see. Not a single inch had the gray hair expanded. It was as if he'd simply stopped aging the moment they got married. Now that she thought about it. Irina, the thief who'd helped her, had grandchildren now, and her hair had gone completely white. She was just as smart as they used to be, but when she'd visited, not nearly so spry. But Maxim. She crossed her arms, watching him. Her father had warned her relationships with humans were doomed to heartbreak. Her mother had laughed, and told her he'd die off soon enough, and she could find herself a proper, elven husband. Her father seemed a bit irate at this, perhaps there was a story behind that. But still. She'd been trying not to think about it for years. She was effectively ageless, and he had perhaps a century at most. Didn't he? As the children scattered off home, likely dismissed early as it wasn't quite time for dinner, Maxim studied her for a moment. She always liked the way he looked at her, as if she were the highlight of his day, compared to the cool appraisal he directed at even the most beautiful of her friends, and stepped forward, his long, loping strides a fraction of her enhanced speed, but fast enough to be startling as he tried to sweep her into the air. For once, she held out her arms, stopping him. He slowed to a stop, blinking. The same deep voice as always. Something wrong, love? You usually don't come by so early, if you're going to, and you look out of sorts. She settled her hands on his chest. The muscles still felt just as firm, usually she liked that. At the moment, though. Over 40 years of marriage. 10 years I knew you before that. You told me when we met you were human. Not that I mind keeping you around longer than expected, but. What's the truth? He gave a slow chuckle. Ah. I wondered how long this would take to come up. Remember when we saved the Eastern Marches, and the Priestess of Light gave us each a boon? Of course. I asked for my homeland to have plentiful crops and peaceful lives. You made that silly one about oaths, I think? I asked her for the goddess's blessing to help keep my oaths, yes. When I swore to slay the Brass King, she empowered my blows and helped keep me moving forward. And at the end of that first adventure, in a small glen not too far from here, I made an oath. To love and protect me for the rest of our lives, till the ocean dries, and the stars fall from the skies. A very romantic moment, if a bit silly, way to propose. Well. Apparently in order to love you for the rest of our lives I still need to be alive. The goddess let me know she'd keep me around as long as I kept my oath. Fortunately, I have every intention of doing just that. Leandra just stared up at him for a moment, and ran forward to wrap her arms around his body, tears staining his already sweat-soaked shirt.